minute to introduce ourselves. I'm Ariadne Kane. I am the moderator. Cindy, you want to go ahead and start us off?
Sure thing. Well, it looks like they're having issues with the audio in the Discord. Just FYI. Yay, and sounds back. All right, so I am Cindy Hung. I write as C.H. Hung. I write primarily science fiction and fantasy. I've got a slew of short fiction published right now, and I dabble in some other genres, but my first love is science fiction and fantasy.
Oh, I should go next. I'm next. Sorry. I'm Kaela Rivera. I'm the debut author of CC Rios in the Desert of Souls. It comes out April 13th, available for pre-order. Just saying. And I also, for my day job, I work as an editor, copy and content editor at a marketing company, which is a lot of fun. Although not it's super relevant to this panel, still a fun fact.
It's my turn. My name is Quiana Chase. I write as Quiana Chase. And I am a writer as well. I currently have one book published called My Brother is Human. It's like a superhero sci-fi coming of age story. And for my day job, I actually work in a space simulator where kids get to experience a story on the bridge of a spaceship. And I get to be the person behind the microphone who controls all the voices and stuff. And I also write some of the missions for those. So also I am a woman. So
my name's Rosalyn Eves, and I write so far primarily for young adult audiences. I have a young adult historical fantasy trilogy, the Blood Rose Rebellion series, that is out now, and I have a young adult historical set in 1878 in the American West that's coming out this summer. And my day job is I teach English at SUU, at Southern Utah University.
Neat.
All right. So let's just go ahead and get into our seed questions. The very first one was, what makes a strong protagonist? And I'm going to throw in a little bit at the end of either male or female. What are the characteristics of any gender of a strong protagonist?
I have two initial thoughts. I guess I'll start out. So I think that two things that make a strong protagonist, or you know what, I'll add three. Three things that make a strong protagonist is being capable, making active choices, like they're the ones who are acting throughout and make the story progress with their choices. And three, having some sort of vulnerability or setback. And we can talk more about why I think that is actually necessary for a strong protagonist, but I do think it's necessary for a strong protagonist.
Yeah, I was going to say something really similar, and I like how you elaborated on it. But basically that the character's actions impact the story and have consequences, and also that they feel like a real person, even if they're a fake person, but they feel real.
I would say it's also someone that you empathize with, someone that you can feel sympathy for. Often, they obviously need to have a strong enough goal to get them through the whole story. But it's also someone who, in particular in other storytelling formats, like, for example, Asian storytelling formats, you don't always get a protagonist who is proactive. And, that's something that we're raised with in the Western storytelling structure. But you always get someone that you can identify with or you can feel sympathy for and who has a really strong goal that they're chasing.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I was interested in this panel is I think we've kind of traditionally defined strength as a very narrow, masculine strength, right? You're physically strong. And I love that none of you guys mentioned that. And that I think we've extended this idea of strength to more of an inner strength and an external strength. The one thing that makes a character strong for me is just persistence. They don't have to be physically strong, but they keep going in pursuit of a goal, even when they fail repeatedly. And to me, that's a big marker for a strong character.
I really liked what Cindy pointed out about how Asian storytelling is often way, way different from more Western storytelling, and that there's different expectations and the protagonists handle things different ways. Because really most important thing about your story and the most important thing about your protagonist is ultimately, does the audience enjoy reading about them? Does the audience enjoy watching them go through the story, whether they are a proactive protagonist? Because that's a very cultural thing. That's not a sign of a good story or a bad story. That's a sign of a culture thing in what we know people will buy books about. That's not a marker of a good or bad story. So it's okay to step out of a lot of those boundaries and rules that we hear about at LTUE, as long as people like reading about your protagonist. So
I would jump on that too and say that throughout the world, culturally, like we describe strength as differently because we all have different cultural values. Like a lot of my story is based in it's a Mexican fantasy, you know, like pulling on stuff that my abuela went through, Mexican American experience, you know, things like that. And so we all have different cultural, like how our culture defines what strength is, but also starting to like Rosalyn was saying earlier, starting to look at different ways that strength can be counted for. Like the whole story of Cici Rios in the Desert of Souls is focused on how her town defines strength as aggression and fierceness and in your face and will not be overpowered constantly. Like that's how everybody defines it the exact same way, and how her strength comes in a completely different way. How she's actually very kind, she's gentle and she's soft, and yet she's also going on this huge adventure to rescue her kidnapped sister, and she has to do all kinds of stuff like that, face all kinds of fearful things, and she is, you know, she's a little bit of a crybaby and she's a little bit afraid of everything, but she keeps going, you know, and like valuing how that kindness ends up winning her a lot of the battles, and that persistence is what gets her through to the end and saves her sister, you know, things like that. Like I wanted to explore in my book that very concept of like, maybe let's look at all the other ways that we can be strong people.
I really like that.
Okay, so what stories have done well with strong women as protagonists?
I call out one of my favorites, which is the Princess Academy series, because Miri was one of those characters, like when I read her, like, but Miri is a really good example of a character who she is definitely the protagonist in her life, and you can feel it, you know, like she makes decisions, those have consequences, but she's not like breaking out like a hammer to fight people all the time. You know, she's not, that's not how she handles things. She loves researching, she loves reading, and she uses those talents and strengths of herself in order to better her life and the people around her. And it's really awesome. I really like it.
Honestly, my favorite example of female protagonists is basically the entirety of the My Little Pony series, like specific of the Friendship is Magic variety, because I didn't start watching it until I was in high school, but I remember watching it, and that was the first time that I'd seen a variety of different like female characters being protagonists and being portrayed on screen, and they were all different and they were all awesome, and it wasn't all about being a girl or girl power, but it was so empowering to me to see all these different types of strengths and weaknesses, and they all felt like people. These cartoon horses were the first time that I'd like watched a show or experienced a story where there were women and there were lots of them and they all felt like people to me. So yeah, I guess they weren't women, they were horses.
One of my very favorite authors, someone I've been reading since I was a teenager, is Louise McMaster Bujold. And I think she does a fantastic job with this. She has the whole spectrum. I mean, she has people like Cordelia, who are sort of your traditionally strong characters, right? She is an expedition leader. She is physically strong. She's mentally tough. And then, but I think my very favorite of her heroines is a woman named Ista, who is like a dowager queen, basically. She is past her prime. Her daughter has moved into positions of power. She's depressed. She's a little bit overweight. She's 40-something. And you very rarely see those kind of women as heroes. I mean, she's very messed up, but she persists. There's something in her that keeps her going, even when she doesn't really have a lot of reason to keep going. And I love that kind of spectrum and that variety.
So I might fangirl a little bit here. I won't lie. If you haven't read the Expanse series or watched the TV show and you like sci-fi, this is a must-read, must-view show. And one of the reasons why I love the show so much and love the books, and I'm all caught up on the books, and I just can't wait for the last one to come out, is because there's such a wide variety of diverse characters in those series, and there's a lot of really great female role models. And I know there was a recent article that came out, and I forget which website posted it, that kind of went through 5 of the main characters that are having their moment on that series right now. I will say, from the moment she showed up on the page, Christian Avarstrala was like, I love her. She is, she is ruthless, and I kind of think maybe I just have this thing for ruthless characters, but she will always, always, always put what is good for Earth and what is good for humanity ahead of everything else, and she will do absolutely anything to ensure that happens. And whether that is, being sorry, the FedEx guy just showed up, and my dogs obviously are like telling me. Okay. Anyway, So whether it's just pushing her agenda through the UN or whatever, Christian's just not afraid to speak up. And another example is Dana Scully from the X-Files, which I know, I remember her as one of an early example of a great female role model on a genre type of series, although there was movies, because she was smart, but she was also confident in being smart. Like, she didn't care about dumbing down her knowledge or about, soothing the male ego or whatever. She was just like, you know what, here's the information, and here's my rationale, and here's what I'm worried about, and, take it for what it's worth. I am just me. And she was just so confident in owning her expertise that I just, even though I didn't become a scientist, I just love that about her as a character.
X-Files is actually a great one because they do take the more almost traditionally flighty character and make that Mulder, and then the more practical character and make that the woman, make that Scully. I loved that growing up, so she was a huge role model for me. So,
Cindy, can I just add one thing? When you were talking about that, I was thinking too about the power of unlikable female characters, because I think for a long time there's been this thing that we can have male characters that are unlikable, but women have to be nice somehow. And I was thinking of Noelle Stevenson's Nimona, if you guys have read that, the graphic novel, and she is not always super likable. She's very bloodthirsty a lot of the time. And I think that's part of her power, is she's like, I don't care about these traditional feminine things. I'm just going to be who I am. And I loved that.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're talking about protagonists, so I didn't bring her up, but Cersei Lannister, oh my God, I love her. I mean, she's horrible, but I love her as a character. I don't understand why. And I think part of it is just she's just so well drawn out. You understand her motivations. You understand why she's doing the horrible things she's doing, like from the beginning to the end. And we won't talk about the end of the TV show. Let's just wait for the books to come out. But yeah, she's one of those. And another example from a protagonist point of view is Rin from the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang. She's not the most likable protagonist you're ever going to see. And I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of that character, but I can totally see how she works as a protagonist, and other people love her, but she can rub people the wrong way. She's not necessarily, miscongeniality. But I love that about her too. It's like, even though I don't relate to her, I love that R.F. Kuang was able to write a character like that and put that before us and say, here's another example of a really great female character or protagonist.
I am a sucker for characters, specifically female characters, who are not liked in the story and for a really good reason. Like, not just, oh my goodness, she's so quiet and nerdy and she has glasses, so, she's an outcast for some reason. But because, like, they're genuinely, like, just really off-putting and do nasty things that have consequences, I am a sucker for that. I really enjoy seeing that in stories and movies.
I'd add to that, like, I think the reason why we like those we end up still kind of liking unlikable characters is because they feel real. You know, like whether they're kind, whether they're on this, like, oh, this poor, sweet, nice character, or this, like, wow, this really horrible bad, she is not dealing with her trauma right, you know, sort of character. Like, whatever level on the spectrum they are on that, like, it's about making them real people. Because people, even unlikable characters, they are unlikable for reasons. Like, I've been an unlikable character in my life. I know I have. I've also been the kind character in my life, and having that spectrum represented in a character is also important, because we're people. We have different moments where they're like, oh my gosh, okay, so she blew up at this person for seemingly no reason, because there was an actual reason inside of her. That my motivation, like knowing the character's motivation and where they're making their choices from, is so key to pulling off any protagonist, I think. Because otherwise, I've heard lots of people say that they didn't like certain female characters and things like that, and I would have to be like, I disagree with you, but I see why you've made that, and it's because you don't understand why she's doing anything she's doing, because it's not been described properly in a movie or in a book. Like, whenever you've created that distance between, like, the protagonist's rationale or their motivations or things like that, very often that's what disconnects them from readers. It's because you're like, I don't know who this person is, they're just doing mean things, I don't know, you know. Or they're just crying in a corner, I don't know why. Like, whatever it is, like, that can really disconnect you, and that can weaken the protagonist to the reader, even if they are maybe not that. Makes sense.
I've been keeping an eye on the audience comments, and they've actually brought up some great characters. Lisbeth Salander for one of the, I think I said that right. For one of the, like, despisable or despicable but yet lovable characters. She's a pretty well-rounded female, and she does some horrible things, but she has incredible motivation for them. So you can really sympathize with her. She's also a pretty good example of, she can be very feminine, but at the same time she does exhibit some of those really strong masculine traits. Does anybody have any others that they wanted to bring up, or should we move on to the next question?
I would say be a little bit careful about categorizing traits as feminine or masculine, because we do have a very broad spectrum when it comes to gender identity and sexual orientation. One of the best novellas I've read in recent memory was Passing Strange by Ellen Clage. And all the protagonists are women, but they they're all queer, and they're trying to navigate a very dangerous society in 1940s San Francisco. And they're all very well-rounded women and characters in their own right, and they don't necessarily have masculine or feminine traits. It's just who they are. One of the things, I used to work in a very male-centric industry, and male-dominated, not male-centric. I'm sorry. And one of the things that drove me crazy was people saying, hey, you're a little too East Coast for Utah. And I'm like, and I actually had that in a formal employee review by my manager. And my manager, he had the best of intentions, right? But what he was trying to tell me was I was too assertive. And I'm like, no. Women don't, we're not too assertive. We're speaking up. We're putting our voice into the mix, and we shouldn't be writing in an environment that says, well, you're too assertive, you're too bossy, you're, too whatever for your gender. We should have. I am so going on a rant right now. I'm so sorry.
A good rant.
We should have characters that are assertive. Period. So yeah, just be a little careful about the categorization too.
Well, I think that's also why sometimes when people talk about unlikable female characters, sometimes it is an issue, like Kaela was saying, of they're just not fleshed out. But sometimes it's exactly what you're talking about. They go against our socially and culturally ingrained expectations. And there's nothing about those expectations that says that's natural to a particular character. But I do think there is a very clear resistance to that sometimes. But I think the only way around that is to continue to put out those unlikable characters who show the whole spectrum of human characterization and feelings.
Yeah, and we also need to be forgiving of each other when the character or a story or whatever we're producing doesn't quite perform up to expectations. We need to be able to have that second chance and to be able to say, well, let's try that again, instead of saying, well, it's because this character is insert whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would also say don't get discouraged if a story that you've produced and didn't quite get the reaction or didn't quite find its audience. Keep going, keep experimenting, because we need to see that someone is going to find it and just relate to it on such a deep level, that we need to keep producing different variety of stories out there.
Yeah. I think if you're a guy, you might not, or at least a cis guy, you might not understand this, but like girls, as we grow up, we are constantly being bombarded with what a girl should and should not be, and they are completely opposite things. Because I remember having a big identity crisis because I was like, I feel like feminine things are bad, but I feel like I should also be feminine and that I shouldn't be masculine, and it was just all so confusing because there were stories that demonized girls who were feminine and there were other stories that demonized girls who were like too masculine, and it was like really, really, really confusing. And the reason why I loved My Little Pony so much is because it did not demonize any aspects. It was just these girls being themselves and doing what they wanted, and they were just themselves. And I think that's the important when we talk about like a strong female character, where it doesn't have anything to do with like their personality traits or their interests or even the trope that they fall into. Like there are very few bad tropes, but they just need to be able to be themselves and have it be okay. And have someone else, another woman who is completely different from them, and that's okay too.
Like I one of the things that I find, I do not like it when people put value on a female character just because of who she is. Whether they're like, oh, well, she's aggressive, so therefore much less valuable female character, or like, oh, well, she's all kind and sweet, so therefore less valuable female character. And you're like, no, they're just human beings. Let them be human beings with strengths and weaknesses, with things to offer and things that pull them back, with development and growth, and with struggles with growth. Like that is, if I could say like in one line how to write a strong female character, it's like write a strong person, write a person, write a good, like write a person well.
Yes.
Along with that, in the comments, Felicity S says that she's also heard from a lot of discussions about the kind of flat portrayals of the Black women as always being the strong or the sassy Black woman, where that's all that they're allowed to be is the strong Black woman. And they don't really show a lot of depictions of the diversity within that set, like that, group of people. Does anybody want to feed off of, that kind of thing, where we've already talked about it a little bit, but the almost racially based genre stereotype for female characters?
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. Because Asian women have a particular stereotype as well, right? And I've definitely run into it in my personal life, as well as in fiction. For the longest time, Amy Tan she was like my role model growing up. And for the longest time, I shied away from writing Asian or Chinese stories because I felt like anything I did was going to sound like Amy Tan, right? But as I got older and had all these other experiences, I realized I can find my own voice within, my experiences and bring some of that into my stories without sounding like Amy Tan. So that was a big part of my journey as a writer, was just finding my own Chinese diasporic voice, right? And one of the things that I think that's one of the reasons why I love what R.F. Kuan did with the Poppy War series is, she didn't have just stereotypical Asian female protagonists and secondary characters in that story. There's different types of female characters in her story. You've got the brash one, you've got the one who is very militant, you've got, all these character types that go against what we've seen so far and what we're allowed to be as Asian women. And so I think, you just keep pushing it and you just keep showing that we're more than just a stereotype. We are real people too, and we all have different experiences, especially, when you are part of a diasporic culture.
Mm-hmm. I would second all of that and say that from when I've seen the way that when people approach things like that, it is because there's very little, and I don't mean to say that anybody who gets this wrong is like a monster or anything like that. I don't believe in saying that. But that very oftentimes it's a lack of understanding, it's a lack of empathy, and it's like this weird wall that's come up in your head where you're like, I don't know what it's like to be that, so I have to grab this stereotype, which is the only thing I know, and put it in there. And I've seen people do it all the time. It happens to Mexican women all the time. It's the sexy Latina is like what you are. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I'm not sexy, and I don't want to be. I'm like, I'm not that. But I would say that, and the same thing for if a man is trying to write a woman, because you really can tell when a man who hasn't thought about it, hasn't broken down some of those walls and stuff, has written them, because you're like, oh, when you read it, any woman could read it and be like, no. But just encourage anybody who wants to do something like that, take time to break down those walls. And it's not just when you're writing, it is when you're going around your life to be like, what I like to call it in writing is character dignity, but I do think it applies to real life as well. As a certain amount of dignity as you treat every person as if they are a person. As a weird example, when I find a very handsome man, I'm so intimidated I do not want to look at him. I'm like, oh no, do not ever talk to him. He's very handsome. As a straight woman, I'm like, oh, flustered about that. But I also realize I'm denying him character dignity when I do that, because I have completely called him a man I am attracted to, and that's all he is. And so I won't talk to him because I'm not treating him as an individual person who has a life outside of what I have characterized him as in my head, because of his effect on me that he has not been trying to do probably. He's like, I'm just existing here. And I'm like, oh, you're so beautiful. But people can do that in more harmful ways and in less harmful ways, to both characters and to people. And I would just say, encourage yourself to realize that when you are doing that, and don't even get all mad and shame yourself about it, because it is human nature. But take the time to be like, oh, we're doing that. Maybe we shouldn't do that. And think about, okay, well, what's he doing? Is he going about his life? Oh, he's getting Cheerios. He likes Cheerios. Neat, because he's a person who likes Cheerios. Now you know that about this human being. And so I think that thinking like that in real life and taking the time to do that also helps in your writing, because you give each of your characters more dignity too. Naturally, even secondary characters will be given more dignity in a sense of like, I'm a real human being, even though they are fictional.
Kaela, Chimamanda Adichie has a really great TED Talk. If you haven't seen it yet, go look up The Dangers of a Single Story. But that's exactly what she talks about, is the dangers of stereotypical thinking. And I think that one of the things that makes writers good writers, and that, I think that writing well-rounded characters is a craft issue. And if you are turning out characters that are falling into stereotypes, that's an immaturity in the writing. And that means you need to, like Kaela was saying, push back against those stereotypes. And also that you have to have done enough research to be aware what those stereotypes are to begin with.
Yeah. And I also think that it's really important, if you're writing someone who is not like you, in any regard, is to, especially if they're a marginalized person, is to find out what kinds of stereotypes surround that kind of person and how, like, what are the taboos in portraying them. I did not do this for my first book. I found out because one of my main characters is a Black girl, and she's, and I feel like I did a good job portraying her as like a person and as a woman, and I felt like I had every right to go about how I portrayed her because my sister is from Ethiopia, and so it's like, oh yeah, like, I know how to write about this person. I'm familiar with her experiences. I can just write about however. But the thing is, the Ethiopian experience is much different from the like African American experience. And so while my sister is totally cool with like, referring to herself as chocolate and being called like chocolate, like that's how her like that's how she refers to her kids, and my mom's kid, like a youngest kid who is the same age, that they like play with each other. It's like, oh, it's chocolate and vanilla. But what I didn't know is, as I like did more research and talked with other like African Americans, is that referring to a skin color to food, like referring it to food, is a big no-no. And there are a bunch of other things that I realized were like really harmful and that hurt people in like their own personal lives. So culture is a huge thing. So if you're going to be writing for Western audiences, make sure that you have like input on what hurts Western audiences.
There's a really great Tumblr called Writing with Color that has all kinds of information and advice on that.
Yeah, that's where I found out about all the things that I had done wrong with that character after the book had already been published, and then I decided that I'd never go without sensitivity readers ever again. So there we go.
Also, and a plug, there is a panel I'm moderating at 7 on sensitivity readers. So
I'm definitely attending that.
One thing I don't think we've mentioned yet, but another way to support having more diverse characterizations, diverse characters. Late and I cannot talk anymore. Is to support one another when you do see a character that has not been done before or done well. It's the more we talk about Black characters who are not the strong Black women stereotype, or Asian characters who are not the quiet, docile little flower stereotype, whatever. The more we talk about this variety of characters, the more we normalize seeing them. And then hopefully that will bring other writers out and help them feel more comfortable writing characters that are closer to, a diverse cast. So yeah, we should also support reading and talking about these different types of characters.
Okay, so to kind of switch back to, or just kind of switch gears a little bit, when you're writing these strong female characters, does it change how you write the story, or the type of story that you are telling?
I think it depends on the kind of biases you have, but you go first. That's all I was going to say.
Okay. I was going to say that I think that, at least for me, stories are all about the protagonist, and I mean, not really all about it. Give all of your other characters dignity too. But that I form the story around my protagonist because there's a journey or something I want to understand through the character's journey, that like I'm designing the whole story around in many ways. Like the next book that I've written is all about a girl who doesn't realize she's being abused. And that's what the whole story is about. So if she had been a different kind of person, it would have changed the story completely, because she would have taken different steps. She would have done this, she would have done that. Because there's so many different ways a story can go. That's something I didn't realize when I was a younger writer, is that your story could go infinite different directions if you let it. It's terrifying when you're in developmental edits and you realize that and you're like, you could be overwhelmed by the possibilities. But I think that's why it's important for you to know what you want out of your protagonist and what your protagonist would do, what their anchored motivations are, what their grand goal is, or even who's conspiring against them, things like that, whatever their antagonist is, because it does change the story. Because the protagonist, at least I think, I'm sure there are stories that do this really wonderfully another way, but I do think that the protagonist should be integral to the story. Otherwise, like, maybe you should have a different protagonist.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
It was, does having a strong female protagonist change the story you are telling or the way in which you tell it?
I think it does. I think a lot of Kaela addressed earlier that the plot should come to some extent from the character. And so if you have a different kind of character who has a different kind of strength, it's going to go a different way. In my historical fantasy series, it was a young woman raised in Victorian England. And so I very much wanted her to be a product of her time. And that meant that in a lot of ways she was physically weak. And so I had to plot, it's a fantasy story. There's battles, it ends in a climactic war, but I had to make sure that the way she was involved it was something that was realistic to who she was in her time period, because I wanted to show that even these women who came from stereotypically weak positions still have like a core inner strength. But yeah, her being a product of the Victorian era made a big difference to the things I could put her through in the plot.
Yeah, I'd agree with what everyone has said so far. It depends on the type of story that you're telling, the genre that you're writing in. One of the more famous examples of a gender swapped role that people sometimes aren't aware of is the Alien franchise. Ellen Ripley was written as a man, and it wasn't until they cast Sigourney Weaver that character became female at all. And you can tell in the first movie, everything is so fast paced, that a lot of the things that she's just dealing with because that is just what's going on, right? And gender isn't necessarily a key part of that. However, that changed in Aliens, which is the second movie. That script was written with all of the secondary characters deliberately written without a gender. And then they casted all the soldiers, accordingly. Ripley, of course, was already cast. So they already knew they had Sigourney Weaver to work with. And she had, in my mind, a much stronger internal character arc in Aliens because they knew at that point she is going to be a woman, right? So it has happened before where you write a story and it's not necessarily crucial to have a specific gender in mind. But again, it's going to depend on the genre and the story that you're telling.
Awesome. Any final thoughts on that particular question before we turn it over to the Q&A?
Oh, this is not specific to that question. I apologize, but this is one thing that I was thinking about earlier that I really wanted to bring up, and that is that I've seen people when they try to do strong female protagonists, and there are two extremes that I would say generally stay away from, which is one, secretly is just a lamp, glorified lamp, really could be replaced with anything, Photoshop anything in there and it could still be the same. Or you get the Mary Sue, which I think people have heard about, but when you get the Mary Sue, because that's not a strong character either. They may be physically powerful. They may be able to do a lot. A lot of the characters may like them for some reason. But they don't come across strongly to the reader because without any struggle, without any growth, or without any problems or vulnerabilities, any character is lessened. So that was just one thing I would say is try to avoid either of those things, because also glorified lamp just means that they don't really exist. They don't have any bearings on anything really, or any exerting choices or exerting any sort of will. Because they're just along for the ride. And I just generally don't like any character that's there just to be there. That's not, they could be a painting on a wall and, so generally I would just, generally speaking, say, stay away from those two things if you can.
Yeah, on that, there is the, what they call the Blechdel test. It's kind of a feminist thing, or it has been tagged as kind of a feminist thing, but it's a real thing. If you have more than two female characters, they need to have a conversation that either does not include the men or does not talk specifically about the men. because otherwise they're not really there. They're just there to help the guys along, and they become the lamp. So
I also second, there's that one and the, what do they call it? They created a new one for the like kick butt lady in Pacific Rim. I forgot what they call it. The Mako test. Yes. Okay. So the Mako test and the Bechdel test, those are some good ones. Those are some good guardrails. Like if you're looking like for help to start doing this, like try to apply those ones to yourself because like they are helpful. They are helpful.
all right, so I think we're ready to start taking questions from our participants, our audience.
All right, so first here from Jen Mirish. The actress Jane Lynch has famously played roles originally written for men. Have you specifically had a character that you originally conceived as male and then changed it up and made them female instead, or vice versa? So similar to our good friend Ripley. So if you did, how did that work out for you?
Actually, I have done that. And that came from a different sort of need of balancing my manuscript because there are a lot of women and a lot of men in my manuscript, but a lot of the women were nuanced and hard because they're coming from the culture where it's expected. And I realized that like Cece creates a little group of friends who are these criaturas who are like sort of outcasts, shapeshifters in her desert. And they were all male initially. And I think that was because I was working out sort of like in my own life. I was like, wow, how would it feel to have supportive men in my life? That'd be amazing. But I realized that it became unbalanced, an unbalanced representation in my own book of there was all of these hard, though nuanced women in like the story, and then like these nice guys. And I was like, I didn't even mean to do that. So I changed one of the characters. I also added a different character for this thing which also solved a bunch of other problems that I was like, oh, that's perfect. 3 birds in 1 stone. But there's one character named Ocelot. If you ever read my book, Ocelot initially was a man, and Ocelot was fairly easy to change because he wasn't very fleshed out in the first like draft when I had him in there anyway. So I was like, and then I was like, hey, that would be fun. So I made Ocelot a woman, a female, and she is with each draft she became more nuanced as well, and part of like Cece's support group throughout the story. Although initially she is a little spooky, and I like that too. I love characters that surprise you.
I thought that I hadn't, but then I remembered that I did, but it was like so buried that I forgot about it. So I went through this phase where I was like I'm still going through that phase, but I was really obsessed with superheroes and I was writing like superhero fan fiction a lot. And there was this one fan fiction that I was writing that I was really attached to, and it involved the premise was basically, what if Bruce Wayne was adopted by the Kents, and what if Superman and Batman had to grow up together? And in that story, Bruce Wayne's like childhood rival was Tony Stark, and they were constantly like going at it. And when I eventually I loved this story and this concept so much that I eventually turned it into a book. And such, of course, I've switched all the names out and the lore is different, but that's my published book as a superhero fan fiction. And one of the adaptations I made is I changed Tony into a girl, and her name is Tasha, and she still plays that role of rival with the main character, who's now called Bryce, which is really like original. I know. Wow, I changed 1 letter in his name. But and like there's no romantic tension. There's no any of that other stuff. And like she's just a snotty little kid. And it's a great time. And I don't know, I had a lot of fun with that.
Okay, any other comments? All right, let's take our next question.
We have from Chantel, I've noticed that I don't see many mothers in fantasy as protagonists. Am I missing them, or is there a reason for this?
There is a reason for this, and we have very Joseph Campbell is one of the reasons why we have this as a reason, is because we've been taught as storytellers in a Western storytelling structure that we need to orphan our protagonists before the story starts. And so guess what? Bye, Mom. See ya.
Yeah. And you also don't get any like mother protagonists. Like you see in action movies a lot that there are dads who are like, and they just like have a family and kids on the side, and that's just like the role that the wife and mother is regulated to. She's not allowed to go on adventures and not allowed to do things and have fun things with her kids. And they were talking about this in the chat, and there's like a whole thing, and you should go back and read it. But it bothers me so much.
I have a hard time focusing on more than one conversation at a time, which is why I have not been following in chat. So I'm sorry if this has been repeated. But one of the reasons why also I know I'm on this kick is in other cultures, when you're talking about stories, they include their families. They've got moms, they've got sisters and siblings and uncles, and they're part of that hero's journey with that protagonist. And we don't see that as often right now. I think that's changing, but we don't see that as often right now because we are stuck on the monomyth. And all I gotta say is, can we please diversify it a little bit more and just let's bring mom, let's make a mom be the protagonist.
Why can't she be the chosen one?
Yeah.
I actually
Cindy?
really suggest. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I really suggest the Netflix series. I think it's called Raising Dion. Like, that was great. And one of the reasons why people actually love Stranger Things is because the mom is a huge part of the story. And like, we have a very individualistic culture in America. So a lot of us is like, let's hone in on that protagonist. They are the only one that matters, but like, bring moms in, bring dads in, like, bring your family in. Like, that's one reason I actually didn't kill off the parents in CCDOs. I thought about it, and then I was like, no, I want my parents in there. Because it's also more communal culture, community culture, Mexican. So, I wanted to do that. But Raising Dion and Stranger Things are some good examples of having the mom in like a main character. Like Raising Dion, she is like the main character. Dion is too, but she has like a very large part of the story, and it is really well done. I actually really enjoyed it, so highly recommend it.
The book I mentioned earlier, Paladin of Souls with Ista, I mean, she is a mom, and she's one of the few prominent sci-fi fantasy mothers I can think of who is the protagonist, not just part of the story. But going back to the hero's myth, I mean, Campbell sort of set it up that for women, their individual arc and adventure ends when they become a mother. And I think that's also part of it, because we have this idea that when you become a mother, that's the fulfillment of your character arc. And so you don't need another adventure. I think that's a big part of it. I do, as a mom myself, I also think, gosh, kids really cramp your style sometimes. It's really hard to have an adventure. I mean, I wrote a story where one of the characters had a dog, and I kept forgetting that she had a dog. And I'd be like, where's the dog? We haven't seen it for 3 chapters. And I do think that there are also complications with writing a mother character, that you have to remember that kids need a lot of work. And it's hard to have adventures when you're taking care of kids. But I do think the biggest reason is just that inherent sexism that says, as a woman, your adventure is over when you have a kid.
Which I think any mom would be like, no, it's not. It's the beginning of another one, a very big one.
Yeah. And I don't know, maybe I'm like just a sucker for stories where there's the kid who's involved in the story and is really important, but is also like a bit of a liability, but they're still like plainly a child. And in one of the stories that I'm writing, the main character like is a mom who, right. Yeah. But yeah, anyway, it's a good time. You can ask me about it later.
All right, so we are out of time. Thank you guys for coming, and thanks for all your great comments.